there's a pretty strong argument, in my view, that under international law, Russia has an obligation to pay reparations for the damage caused by its war of aggression against Ukraine. It's pretty clear they invaded Ukraine. It's pretty clear that they've killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, that they've occupied about 20% of the country, an area about the size of England, and totally trashed it. It's pretty clear that they've done damage worth hundreds of billions. I've seen one estimate of 506 billion euro. That's even more than these frozen assets. So I think you can ask yourself, just in common sense terms, leaving apart the legal arguments, is Russia's action in invading Ukraine so appalling that the usual rules shouldn't apply?
Now, today, the UK and allies issued a warning of a Russian state-sponsored cyber campaign targeting the delivery of support to Ukraine and Western logistics and technology companies. Ukraine supporters are trying to scramble together support, and there's a massive potential reservoir of that needed cash. 300 billion euros or so worth of frozen Russian assets. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk to Leigh Turner, the former UK ambassador to Ukraine. But first, let's talk to Tom Keating, hear from Tom Keating, who worked at JP Morgan for nearly 2 decades and is now director at the Centre for Finance and Security at RUSI. He gave us a clearer idea of what and where those assets actually are.
So those are the foreign exchange reserves of Russia that were held mainly at Euroclear in Belgium in the lead up to the full-scale invasion, and which were frozen by the G7 in the early part of the war. The question that needs to be answered is what to do with them. There's been a lot of debate about seizing them, giving them to Ukraine. Last summer, the G7 agreed to make loans to Ukraine secured against those assets, but that's really only a half measure. It was a bit of a fudge at the time it was agreed. So now we need to figure out what to do with these assets. There's been a lot of legal discussion, but I think that legal discussion has been put to bed. And the simple way of dealing with this is to say that those assets will be taken and used for the benefit of Ukraine as a countermeasure against Russia. So what is a countermeasure? It's a legal construct, which means that if somebody wrongs you, if you get invaded, as in the case of Ukraine, you can take steps against the invader, in this case Russia, to try and coerce them to reverse what they are doing. So what we have been suggesting at RUSI is to take control of those assets for the benefit of Ukraine, so take them away from Russia, but not give them to Ukraine, because if you gave them to Ukraine, you couldn't reverse that should, miraculously, Russia stop its war, give back all the territory, including Crimea, and pay reparations to Ukraine. So you would take those assets, and then basically you would manage them in a way to generate an annuity, a constant stream of income for Ukraine, so it could support its defence procurement and its general economy.
And here is an explanation of the process by which these assets could be seized.
So by using the countermeasures legal argument, you would move the assets, which are currently technically the property of Russia, you'd move them into an account that would be for the benefit of Ukraine. That would stop Russia being able to access those assets should, of course, the sanctions be lifted because of some issue in relation to the renewal in the EU. And then, because they are no longer immobilized, that would allow asset managers and banks to invest those assets and to earn a greater return than they are currently earning. Currently, they're probably earning merely a cash return because the assets have matured. They were originally mainly bonds. They've matured and have basically delivered a load of cash. But as we all know, you don't earn much interest on cash. So what would happen is, having moved to a new account, the asset managers, probably European asset managers, would be able to invest those assets, earn a higher return, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7%, and thus earn an annuity income for Ukraine based on that big lump of a couple of 100 billion euros worth of cash.
And as Tom explains, we're coming up to a pretty important inflection point.
Every 6 months, the sanctions that the EU has placed on Russia need to be renewed. And of course, there are countries, particularly Hungary, that could be spoilers in that process. And were they to be spoilers, because sanctions need to be renewed on a unanimous basis, were they to be spoilers, that would mean that potentially the assets of the Central Bank of Russia would return to Russia if the sanctions were not renewed. And of course, that would be an extremely embarrassing situation for the European Union and a terrible situation for Ukraine. So coming up with a longer-term solution to how to deal with the assets of the Central Bank of Russia, held primarily in Belgium by an organisation, a bank called Euroclear, really should be a priority right now. And it is an area where the UK could get involved. The UK has smart financial minds, smart financial engineers in the City of London, and that's something where the UK could really contribute, particularly as part of this kind of reset of relations with the EU.
Tom Keating at RUSI. Now, let's welcome to the programme Leigh Turner, who's a former British ambassador to Ukraine and the author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. Hello to you, Leigh.
Afternoon, John.
Good to have you here, Leigh. Tell me, so what are your thoughts on this question of these hundreds of billions of euros worth of Russian assets and the case for seizing them?
Yeah, well, this argument has been going on for literally years, actually, since these funds were first seized in February 2022. And there's all kinds of legal arguments about whether it's lawful or not to seize them. There's a pretty strong argument, in my view, that under international law, Russia has an obligation to pay reparations for the damage caused by its war of aggression against Ukraine. It's pretty clear they invaded Ukraine. It's pretty clear that they've killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, that they've occupied about 20% of the country, an area about the size of England, and totally trashed it. It's pretty clear that they've done damage worth hundreds of billions. I've seen one estimate of 506 billion euro. That's even more than these frozen assets. So I think you can ask yourself, just in common sense terms, leaving apart the legal arguments, is Russia's action in invading Ukraine so appalling that the usual rules shouldn't apply? And I would argue that, yes, its behaviour is so far beyond the pale that we should look imaginatively at how to use these funds to generate some help for Ukraine, military or economic.
No, I know you're an experienced diplomat, not a lawyer, but does the I don't know the scale of the horror that we're talking about, does that bear on the legality of the case for doing so?
Well, it's lawyers. It's on the one hand and on the other. And if you look at the lineup, we've got the UK and Poland and the Baltic states and some Scandinavian states who are quite clear that this money should be confiscated or at least put somewhere safe so the Russians can't get at it in the event that sanctions should be lifted for some reason. And then you've got some other states, principally Belgium, actually, where this money is actually physically kept in as much as any of it is physical money, who are very worried that if anything happens to that money on their watch, they might be sued by Russia later. So they're dead against it. So there's a pretty big debate going on. But I think a kind of halfway house of the type that we were hearing about there from RUSI is a pretty good way of doing it, actually, to put the money into a fund where it can generate more cash to help support Ukraine. And then if for some reason Russia changes its absolutely appalling policy and decides to withdraw. I mean, for example, if President Putin somehow, something happened to him and a different leadership took over in Russia, which, while it wouldn't be any less hardline probably, at least wouldn't be identified with this war and would be able to take a different approach. Were that to happen, then you could consider giving back the money if Russia were to withdraw from Ukraine, including, of course, Crimea. Yeah,
as far as I'm aware, there's a pretty broad consensus among ministers that this would be the right thing to do. The problem, the objections are legal. But I think to that, and I'm going to be going into this in more detail later, I think to that it is argued you could put through some sort of legal instrument which makes clear this is a one-off in special circumstances and would not just be applied willy-nilly.
It's already happened that the EU has passed legislation saying that they can use the interest from this 300 billion
so
euro
same principle
to help Ukraine. So I think it should be possible, if you have sufficient political will, to use this money. And really, John, I think we have to ask ourselves, is it reasonable for us to think imaginatively about ways to hurt Russia economically? At the moment, they have an undeclared war against us. They're subverting our institutions. We've heard about these cyber attacks. We've seen signs, apparently, that the Russians have been trying to put bombs on aeroplanes, on DHL, really appalling things. We've seen shopping centres burned down in Poland and other such attacks on countries way beyond Ukraine. And I think we do need to think very actively about how we can use this money Sure, there are important long-term principles we need to take account of, but Russia's gone so far beyond anything that's reasonable in this appalling war against Ukraine. I'm deliberately not using the word genocidal, which is tossed around much too often in my view, but clearly killing hundreds of thousands of people is an awful act of aggression, and anything we can do to put pressure on Russia to pull its forces out to end this war as soon as possible, we should be doing.
I mean, it's argued that the way to do this is to push it through the G7, a group of advanced economies, and clearly there's sympathy for doing that among European leaders. Where would the objections come from? I think America isn't quite so keen.
It's always difficult to know what the US is going to do since January, since President Trump became president, and he is not a man who always says he's going to do one thing and then follows through with that. He does seem to change his mind quite often, or indeed reverse policies, as we've seen on his tariffs. So it's difficult to know what he would do if this question came to the G7, and I can imagine that other members of the G7, including the UK, Germany, France, Italy, would probably be a bit chary about bringing this to the G7. Originally, the freezing of Russian sanctions was done, as I mentioned, in February 2022 after the Russian full-scale invasion, and that included the US under Joe Biden. How the US would react now, we have absolutely no way of knowing.
All right, Leigh, thank you. Leigh Turner, the former UK ambassador to Ukraine.